Hello there, and welcome to another rendition of my Friday show and tell, which tend to focus on RAG, which is Retrieval Augmented Generation in AI. I love it because it grounds AI in reality. It allows you to use your existing body of content as the ultimate source in the context. And so perhaps last time I did this, I was going through this RAG upload pipeline that I created in Replit with a connection to Pinecone, which is what I use as the vector database that stores all this content so that I can retrieve it. And it works very simply. You give it one URL, multiple URLs. You can give it a sitemap.xml file with many URLs. And then you can set how you want it to upload to Pinecone, what index, what namespace, and then the different embedding settings in terms of the model, the chunk size, the dimensions, etc. It also has a web scraper component. So this works for like most of the things that I need it to work for. But I recently started working with a client who had a different type of data that needed to be processed. And so in this case, it's podcast transcripts. And so we're looking at, not so much URLs and web pages, but documents such as a Google Doc or a Word doc that have an episode name, and then they have the body copy, which is the transcript itself. And so I have built some agents to interact with RAG in Zapier so far, but I recently started playing around with n8n as another tool that I could use, kind of with the idea of making some slightly more robust workflows, especially that have like different code components and things like that. And so I actually initially tried to build what you see here in Replit, but was having a lot of issues. I think I probably could have resolved it with going maybe a different way about how I handled like Google Cloud credentials, and I'll kind of explain how it all interacts in a second here. But ultimately, this felt like the right way to build this for somebody else. Like things could certainly still break in Replit, but I can just go and mess around and fix them. But when I'm handing this off to a client, I want to be really sure, that like all the pieces kind of make sense, and like it's not like the user interface or like the coding that's going to get in the way. And so n8n just kind of felt like the right fit for this project, and really just a good excuse to get to know it a little more. So anyway, so the transcripts, again, it's like a Google Doc, you can imagine, with like two major components. And the way that I decided to process them, and in such a way that I could hand this off to a client so that they don't have to worry about all the details, is that each transcript becomes a row in a sheet, and then there's different column headers. So you can imagine the episode name, the episode URL, and then in a different workflow than the one you see here, the one that happens just previous to this, whenever a new file is added to a certain folder in Google Drive, it then processes that file so that it goes on the Google Sheet, and it also does the chunking of the text, just like the RAG upload pipeline lets you set a chunk size and the chunk overlap, etc. I probably could have done that in this step here, but I kind of wanted all that processing of the data to happen in that previous workflow, with the exception of one thing. Let me walk through kind of how this works and how that sheet interacts with it. And I tried to add labels to everything just so that it would be a little bit more obvious what's going on, especially for me going back and trying to explain it. So first of all, this workflow runs manually. You can set workflows in n8n to being on or off. But it kind of just makes sense to run this when you know that you have new content to embed in your Pinecone vector database. Whenever, again, that previous workflow runs, which I think is set to automatic because it is looking for new documents in that folder. So you could turn this on, and you could set a similar thing that says whenever there's a new row in a Google Sheet. I just haven't set it up that way. So then this step is basically like the way that it works in n8n, and more experienced users correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of like you want to set certain, we'll call them variables, that you can use later in the workflow, because otherwise it's like each of these nodes, each of these steps, in a sense, is almost independent. Like the data flows from one to another, but it doesn't necessarily flow from like step 1 to step 3, if that kind of makes sense. So some things you want to set as being sort of like reusable, and so that's what this step does. And it also includes referencing the specific sheet that we're going to use, that we're going to be checking for those new rows of data, and then also updating at the end of this, which I'll show you what I mean by that. You have to do sometimes, especially when working with like a sheet, for example, in different ways in different workflows, but sometimes you have to like actually download that file. It's not kind of like working in the cloud. It's kind of like downloading and then like re-uploading that data, depending on the step here. So that's what this does. It accesses the Google Sheet and then it extracts the file in a certain format. And then this step translates what's in the sheet so that it can be chunked with the associated metadata. So basically it's preparing for it to go into Pinecone with each chunk, each piece of that transcript, which is about 600 characters or something like that, also being associated with a specific episode name and a specific episode URL. Okay, so then this happens here, and I guess I thought I did it in this step, but I think it's actually in the previous step when it's getting added to the sheet. I wanted to prepare for those transcript documents to not have an episode URL. And so what I did was I created another step in that previous one where it's basically, there's like a web scraping step. I think it's another like HTTP request where it uses the name of the document, which is the episode name, and it searches on the website for the episode like page itself. And then it grabs that URL and it adds it to the sheet, because it's going to be important in this workflow, which it has, I think, like 5 different agents that work at different steps. It's going to be useful later because there's a component that then works with what's in the Pinecone vector database to suggest a relevant episode in response to somebody writing a social post about an episode, or not an episode, a topic that may have been covered in the podcast. So for example, if your podcast is about, I don't know, SEO or something like that, and somebody is asking about GEO best practices, you can share that post with the agent, assuming it was set up for, that particular purpose. And it will then return a response, a social post that says, oh yeah, these are kind of like our best practices. By the way, if you want to learn more about this, check out this episode. Here's the link. So that's why that part is important here. So yeah, so this just like preps everything so that it is going to be in the right format to then be added to Pinecone so that all the details are associated with every chunk. So then we get into the Pinecone vector store, and there's not a whole lot to it. This was probably one of the easier steps to set up. The harder part is really like preparing the chunks in terms of your data and like what you want the metadata to be. You have to add these 2 components for this particular step, which is insert documents, which is like the upload process. And so you pick your embeddings model, you have to add credentials. And so there's different ways that you do this in Pinecone. I think for this one, it was just user authentication, but sometimes it's adding an API key. And so I kept like my batch size small because first of all, I was testing. I would probably expand this actually and sending it off to the client, but also because there's not going to be that much happening when this is running. It's probably going to be podcast transcript by podcast transcript one at a time. And then you have this data loader, which again is taking that previous step and kind of mapping it here to the data that gets uploaded itself, and then the metadata, the episode name, the episode URL, published at. So that's why that step is so important, because you're just mapping, exactly what you want, where you want. I said this one's kind of hard to explain, but it's necessary for the last step, which is in the Google Sheet. I don't want it to keep re-embedding the same rows. I don't want it to go in and every time I run this, embed everything that's in the Google Sheet. I only want it to re-embed or to specifically embed something that hasn't been embedded before, because with OpenAI, you're basically paying API credits every time that you run this. And so it should only be things that you want to embed. And sometimes your data changes. So essentially it adds a column that says embedded ? And then this workflow, when it runs, adds the word yes in there. And it skips, and I'm trying to remember where that happens. It might be in the other workflow. I don't think I have it in this one. This one is strictly to run it and to add that to the Google Sheet, the embedded thing. Let me just open it really quick. I think it happens in the other workflow, and then it tells you like what to skip essentially. But anyway, so it's looking for, you use the row number itself to match, and then you add, I think it's at the end here. I lied, it's at the very beginning. You just add this text yes to embedded, and then based on whatever part of the workflow I added this, if it says yes, then it will not run this workflow for that run again. But if I took the yes out, if I deleted it because I wanted to reprocess the data, maybe I added some new metadata, maybe I wanted to correct something in the transcript, then it would run again. So anyway, it sounds probably more complicated than it is. And in fact, like it definitely took, some time for me to get to this point, especially learning a new tool. n8n is not something that I really used before building this agent for this client. But yeah, so it's like that RAG component then feeds into another agent. There's another component that feeds into this to even like chunk and like get that data accessible. And then there's a whole other part of it that is an agent that I've built previously, where it's taking in news sources, it's finding the ones that are most relevant and timely, and then it's creating relevant social posts on behalf of a brand. So this is a really fun project. Hopefully it gives you some ideas, especially, if you saw my previous video about this RAG upload pipeline. That's one way that you could do it. Here's a totally different way you can do it. That's flexible for different types of data. And also, if you're not a vibe coder, but you're more of like an automator, like no code person, I used a lot of ChatGPT, back and forth to help me with these different steps. And, something that I learned with that is that a lot of the data in ChatGPT, like what it was trained on about n8n, is just like out of date. Like there's new ways to refer to these different nodes, there's new UI elements, there's new settings. So you kind of have to go back and forth, take it with a grain of salt. And n8n also has its own little AI assistant copilot. So that's what I got for you today. Let me know if you have any questions, and certainly always interested in hearing what other people are building with RAG, with n8n, with different agent tools. And this is mine for today.